Hello, hello. So, over the last 6 years, we have been measuring how companies treat their employees and how the employees feel about the company, and we've connected that to alpha, stock market return. And the basic notion is that we want to quantify human capital, right? And one of my partners in this is saying that human capital is an accounting mistake. What does he mean? He says, when a company buys a warehouse, it's an investment. When a company invests in people, it's a cost. It shouldn't be like this. In fact, when companies invest in people, they should be able to take credit for it on their quarterly earning and annual returns. Right now, investment in human capital are a cost. They're not considered investment, and that's what Christoph means, that it's an accounting mistake. And we hope that one day companies will start thinking more carefully about human capital. What do we have? How much do we invest? And so on. And maybe the investors would react to that as well, because there's no question, if you think about a company and how much it can produce, human capital, how happy people are, motivated, interested, excited, and so on, is an important issue. Okay, so we all agree that human capital is what runs companies. It's like the engine, the lubricant that runs companies. We all understand that companies don't account for it in a clear way. We don't really understand what's the human capital in, company X, Y, and Z. And some time ago, I was invited to a government meeting about trying to quantify human capital. I was very excited. The government is thinking about this. But I quickly became disappointed for a couple of reasons. The first one is that I think that the real challenge with human capital is we want to think about the upside. We want to think about the measurement that would contribute to human flourishing. But when you talk to lawyers and we talk to regulators, what they mostly want to do is to prevent bad things from happening. So instead of saying, how do we create human flourishing, they say, how do we prevent bad things from happening? Very different approaches. You would come up with very different solutions if you want a measurement for human flourishing versus you want a measurement of, let's find how many bad points you had and let's try to minimize the bad points. Of course, we prefer both of them, but they're very, very different in nature. So that's one thing. Do we think about the upside or do we think about the downside? And I think most bureaucratic systems think about the downside rather than the upside. Not how do we get more of the system, it's how do we get less bad things out of the system. But the second bad thing is that we have a tendency, we've talked many times about this idea of doing what's in the letter of the law and not the spirit of the law. We have a tendency to create systems that are check-the-box approach. And check-the-box approach is one example of doing the letter of the law and not the spirit of the law. And it's a terrible system because by doing check-the-box approach, we are basically emptying the value out of what we're trying to do. And I'll give you an example. In the US, there's an index called the SHE index, SHE. And the way that they used to work is they used to say, let's take all the companies in, let's say, the S&P 500, and let's sort them from the company who has the highest ratio of women at the board and in the C-suite to the companies that have the lowest ratio. So the highest ratio to the lowest ratio. And let's invest in the companies who are at the highest ratio. So basically saying, let's just invest in companies where there are many more women on the board and many more women on the C-suite and so on. And you can argue about the merit of the idea, but we can say, how is an investment with this strategy, how successful is it in the stock market? And the result is that it's not very successful. It's actually not a good approach. Now you can ask, why is it not a good approach? We all feel that having more women in companies being treated well would be a good idea. Well, this measurement is not necessarily a good measurement. And here's the story. is having a higher ratio of women necessarily mean that we treat women well? The answer is no. You could have professions like teaching and nursing, where it's mostly women and most of them are being treated badly. Just having more women doesn't mean that they're being treated fairly. It doesn't mean that the people who are added to that mix, the board, the C-suite, feel fairly treated. And even if they do feel fairly treated, it doesn't mean that it permeates for the rest of the company. Imagine a woman engineer in company X. And one day they assign a new person to the board, and that person is a woman. Does the engineer in that company, that woman engineer, feels better the next day? Not necessarily. She would feel better if the company dealt with the issues of inequality and lack of fairness, but assigning somebody at the top often feels like window dressing. The company doesn't really care about me, they just want to look good for the press. And in fact, when we look at my data, which is how women feel in the organization, it turns out that companies where women and men feel more similar, and by the way, it doesn't matter if they're both satisfied or unsatisfied, but more similar, do better. In companies where men are feeling disproportionately better than women about the way they're being treated, don't do as well. So fairness and equality, unbelievably important. The problem is that when we have a ridiculous measure, that's not necessarily right. So in the She Index case, the measurement was just not the right measurement. And by the way, if I told you about this and you thought about it for 5 minutes, you would say, why would it be necessary? I can see why counting women at the top management and the C-suite and the board is easy to do, very easy to do, but there's no clear relationship between then and feeling treated fairly, and certainly not across the company. So the first point is that sometimes we measure what's easy rather than what's important. But the second thing is that once we create a measurement, sometimes it has a life of its own, especially in this life of check the box approach. Do we have enough women? Check the box. It's much, much harder to go to companies and say, please treat everybody equally. Please treat men equally and women equally, and treat people from this heritage and that heritage and this. Please treat people equally. Very hard to do. We have to trust companies to do the best they can. It's very tempting to say, here's the check the box approach. Please check this, this, and this. But the problem is that with the check the box approach, companies can do what's in the check without the real thing. And that is what bureaucracy is doing. Rather than dealing with the difficult, complex topic, rather than saying getting people to feel good in our company, in our organization, is a struggle we need to work on all the time. We need to be aware. It's like a diet. We'll never win. We'll always have to struggle, and we always have to improve, and we always have to work on it. Instead, it's much easier to say, no, we'll take the legal approach. Check those 3 X's, and if you check on these 3 X's, nobody will do anything to you. It's easier to do. It's tempting to feel that we're doing the right thing, but the reality is that check the box approach often doesn't achieve anything, and sometimes, like in the She Index, even gets things worse.